Good evening. My name is Lauren Batchelor, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or any devices that make noises. Tonight's speaker, James Conroy, practices law in Boston as a co-founder of Donnelly, Conroy, and Gelhar, LLP, one of the city's leading litigation firms. Conroy is a graduate of the University of Connecticut and served for 6 years as a photographer and journalist in anti-submarine aviation units in the United States Navy Reserve. While working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. as a speechwriter and as a press secretary in the 1970s and early 1980s, he earned a master's degree in international relations at George Washington University and a law degree, magna cum laude, at the Georgetown University Law Center. His first book, Our One Common Country, was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, awarded to the author of the best book of the year on Lincoln, a Civil War soldier, or the Civil War era. Tonight, Mr. Conroy will be joining us for a discussion about his book, Lincoln's White House, the People's House in Wartime. Conroy's discussion will focus on the use of the White House by Abraham Lincoln and his staff as a political tool in his dealings with Congress, the electorate, and the reelection campaign of 1864. Following Mr. Conroy's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please wait until the student ambassador with the microphone reaches you before beginning your question. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Conroy.
Thank you for that generous introduction. We hit the lights, that's great. It's an honor to be here. This is my second time speaking here. I spoke here 2 years ago about the first book, and I guess I'm just going to keep trying until I get it right. So I appreciate the opportunity. I should say at the beginning that there have been, they tell me, 13,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. So anybody who makes it 13,002 has some explaining to do, and I want to just briefly summarize, why I wrote this book and what I tried to achieve in it. First, what interested me was the thought of trying to recreate what it was actually like to live and work and be entertained in Lincoln's White House. No one had ever approached that subject before. I wanted to know, what kind of a boss he was, what kind of a security there was or wasn't in that era, what the food was like, what the entertainment was like, who the staff were, the professional staff, the servants, the whole sort of feel and life on a daily basis in the White House in Lincoln's time. And once I started down that road and got into the research, it became clear to me that there were some bigger, perhaps more important issues to be looked at as well. One of those was the way in which Lincoln used the White House, learned to use the White House as a tool for three major purposes that I'll go through as we go through these slides today. The first is as a way for the president to communicate directly with the American people, keeping in mind that there was no television in those days, no radio. There were newspapers, but they were very partisan newspapers, almost in every case. Hard to believe, I know that there were partisan newspapers in politics in those days, but no real way for the president to get on television or on the radio and just speak directly to the people. And as we go through this, you'll see how Lincoln did that in the White House. The second major concept here is the use of the White House as a platform to support and advance the war. And the third is as a tool for racial progress, which, as we'll see, was an important part of how Lincoln used and learned to use the White House as well. I'm going to try to do this efficiently so that there'll be time for questions and answers and the rest. I want to give credit to the White House Historical Association, which provided many of the images that you'll see this evening, and also to a website called Civil War in Color, which takes black and white Civil War photography and colorizes it with Photoshop technology. You'll know which ones they are when you see them, but they really are pretty cool, and they make things pop that we're not used to seeing in this era. None of it done by me, so I can be completely open in my praise for it, but it's really pretty remarkable stuff. So I think any discussion of Lincoln's White House ought to start with Lincoln's White House, which is in this restored photograph taken in the 1860s. And if you look at it, it sort of illustrates what I think of as the combination of strange and familiar in the entire subject of Lincoln's White House, which recurs throughout the book. It's familiar, you know it at a glance what it is, it's the White House. But when you look a little more carefully, you'll see that it's really pretty strange. There is no East Wing off to the left there, where there is now with the First Lady's offices and press offices and other things. There's no West Wing off to the right, including the Oval Office where the President now presides in the West Wing. There's just the building itself with a little conservatory tacked on to the western end there on the right. We'll talk about that in a minute. You'll see that instead of the fountain that we now have in front of the White House and the beautifully landscaped grounds, you've got an old statue of Jefferson that now stands in the Capitol building. One of Lincoln's young aides said it was very ill kept and reminded him of a moldy old Indian just dug up. And if you look at the shrubbery around the statue, you won't see anything very impressive. These are kind of scraggly bushes that somebody kind of stuck out there, which is kind of emblematic of the general condition of the White House at this time. As you'll see, it's not very impressive inside or out with regard to furniture or furnishings or upkeep or maintenance of any kind. The trees that you see in front no longer exist. And I think maybe something we can relate to personally, the windows are open, if you look carefully. This was taken in the summer, and as one of Lincoln's aides said, you could either keep the windows closed and be steamed like a head of broccoli, or open them and be bitten to death. So that was your choice, and in this case, I guess they took the steam option. This is a long shot view of the White House taken also during Lincoln's presidency. For those of you who are familiar with Washington, it's taken from about where the Holocaust Museum is now. This is the mall. Off here to the right was the Washington Monument, only half built at the time, kind of a broken tooth look to it, about halfway up. And here you see the White House off in the distance, the south front of the White House, the Treasury Department, which still stands there today, and otherwise almost nothing, which is pretty much what you had in Washington in the 1860s. Very underdeveloped compared to what we now know. You can even see off in the distance there the mountains, the Shenandoah Mountains, which I can promise you can't see now from Washington. And one thing I guess you could say to its favor is you could get a parking space on the mall in those days. No school buses, no tourists double parked. This is a view of the north front of the White House done by an engraver a few years before Lincoln's time. The statue of Jackson is still there. Anthony Trollope, the British novelist, wrote about Washington in the early 1860s when he came to visit, was very unimpressed. The book talks about how the roads, the streets, the housing, everything else was pretty shabby, just barely out of the wilderness stage. Trollope said that this statue of Jackson did not impress him. The horsemanship was absurd, and the writer was manifestly drunk. And he goes on to say that certainly this statue, at any rate, will someday be removed. Still there today. This map, contemporary map of the city in the area of the White House was done in 1861, Lincoln's first year in office. And I show it to you primarily for two reasons. One, you can see this light development all around it. It's denser in the immediate area of the White House. But as you go a few blocks away, it's very thin. And if you got up this way, you'd see almost nothing at all. It's completely undeveloped. Second reason I show it to you is in those days, there was a canal leading up from the Potomac River down here that ran up along the city on Constitution Avenue, which is now the mall. The mall is over here. There's the Washington Monument, what there was of it. And the canal had not been used for decades. It had been built for a kind of a commercial venture that failed. And it was therefore this pool, if you will, of stagnant water into which flowed the sewers of the city, whatever dead bodies of animals and pets and carcasses, sometimes the occasional human corpse, and the water at low tide on an August day, as you can imagine, was not a pleasant thing to be around. One of Lincoln's aides writes home to Illinois and says, "I'm writing you this letter as the ghosts of 20,000 drowned cats drift in from the south windows." So you get a sense of this being a different place than the White House we know today. This is a contemporary engraving of the south portico of the White House, looking back down that view that we just saw on the map. Over on the far left, you see the stub of the Washington Monument. Further in, you see the little tent that was built at the time where the Marine Band would play on summer afternoons for the public, which were invited to wander the president's grounds anytime they chose to, except on Sundays. And you see up on the portico itself some guests filtering out from the Blue Room for a reception for the Prince Napoleon, who's standing here with the red sash. The point being that the grounds were well kept. The south grounds were very kind of park-like, and it was a public park for anybody to wander who chose to do so. This is a contemporary photograph of the south portico. The wall here was known at the time as Jefferson's Wall, that enclosed the perimeter of the White House, having been built by Jefferson. There is the conservatory off to the west. And the children are believed to be friends of the Lincoln boys, Tad and Willie, who often played there on the south lawn. And beneath Jefferson's wall, in the area that's now known as the Ellipse, down into Constitution Avenue and the mall, was basically an enormous junkyard, is the easiest way to describe it. Literal piles of trash, old unused building materials, piles of old lumber, just a kind of a dump really, where Lincoln would sometimes go down with his aides and practice the new weaponry, shooting targets at piles of lumber and the rest. This is an engraving of the conservatory, which was a great favorite of Mrs. Lincoln, who loved flowers and plants and knew them very well, and would go in there and order from the bouquet man, as he was called, arrangements for her friends that would be sent around town in February or March or January, these beautiful floral arrangements, fruit baskets, things of that kind, which were thought to be miraculous in this day. There was no such animal in 1861-65 as flowers and fruits and such in the winter. Early on, it was open to the public. One of Lincoln's aides said that the public was presumed to be above stealing flowers, and when that presumption proved to be false, it was closed off to the public and only open to the family and their guests. This photograph, also of the south front, I'm showing you to point out what at the time was called the basement, this lower level here. The White House ground slopes from the north down to the south, so that at Pennsylvania Avenue side, on the opposite side, the basement here is at basement level, whereas here it's kind of a walkout basement. It's now very formal, polished rooms with the diplomatic reception room and other very grand rooms, as you would have seen if you've taken a White House tour. At the time, it was, as one of the aides said, like something you had smelled on the edge of a swamp. Infested with rats. Lincoln once suggested that they get a ferret to set the ferret loose in the basement to kill the rats. And while they're at it, they should get ferrets for the whole city of Washington, which was full of rats, as Lincoln said. Lincoln, all of the plant was down in the basement, the coal-fired furnace, the gas lines, it was all gas-lit at the time, the water system, the water pump for hot and cold running water. There were some flush toilets, although not many. And one day the pump broke. Nobody could figure out how to fix it. So Lincoln went down with a monkey wrench and an army captain and fixed it and had the captain over for lunch afterward. This is the strange part about, as opposed to the familiar part. This is a floor plan of the first floor, the formal floor of the White House, which is really not very different from the way it is today. The main exception is, here's the entrance. You come in under the north portico. There's this vestibule here. At the time, there was a little storm entrance here and closing the door to keep wind and such out. The main difference is here, the Porter's Lodge, as it was called, which was where an old Irishman by the name of Edward McManus had his place of business. He was the porter. He was about 5'2", full of sarcasm and humor and wit, like, sort of the archetype of an Irish leprechaun. Had been through 7 or 8 administrations, had all the stories and tales you can imagine about all those old presidents, and would sort of scrutinize people as they came in and decide whether they were important enough to be treated well or not. One Englishman came in and wrote about it later and said that old Edward, as he was called, had sized him up as small potatoes and told him that it was entirely up to him as to whether he put his hat and coat on a table in the vestibule or not, but he would suggest taking it with him, there being all kinds of people around. Edward and his aide, his assistant, who was about 6'4", so you can think of Edward as 5'2", and his assistant Burns as 6'4". It's kind of Mutt and Jeff team. Edward and Burns made up the entirety of the White House security in 1861. There were no guards, no sentinels, no soldiers, no Secret Service, completely unprotected for all practical purposes. I show you this reception in the East Room, first of all, as an example of the entertainment and such that was held there, but also to say that this is an idealized version of what the East Room looked like and what all those other formal rooms looked like. Mrs. Lincoln, when she came in there in 1861 for the first time, said she was shocked by what she called that dilapidated mansion that they walked into, that there was not a stick of furniture there that she would have had in her house in Springfield, Illinois. Frayed carpets, worn out rugs, handprints on the wallpaper, vandalized pieces of tassel cut off by people who walked through. They would saw off the finials on the chairs, take them away. You have to kind of imagine what one of Lincoln's aides referred to as a third-class hotel. This is, we get briefly into the 3 professional aides that Lincoln had throughout the Civil War. The first here, John George Nicolay, who went by the name George, was Lincoln's private secretary. And by statute, there was only one official aide to the President of the United States, one staff person, private secretary, who was George Nicolay at the time. Nicolay was of German birth. He'd been born to illiterate German peasants and came to this country when he was 6 years old with his parents, who died not long thereafter. He was orphaned at a very young age, grew up pretty much on his own, and by sheer luck got taken up as an apprentice by a newspaper owner. And in the course of that, that experience, started out as what they call the printer's devil, just doing little odd jobs and helping set up the type and that kind of stuff. later became a writer, a reporter, then an editor, then one of the publishers, and eventually bought the newspaper. He called it a poor man's college. So this is where George Nicolay learned how to write, how to think. Political people passed through all the time, including Lincoln, which is where they met. The second aide to Lincoln as his assistant private secretary did not exist. The title did not exist. John Hay, who is the young man here, was 22 years old at the time, was brought also from Illinois and assigned as an Interior Department clerk. But then Lincoln had him detailed to the White House for special duty, which was just a bureaucratic dodge to get another aide, into the White House. Hay was a graduate of Brown, the son of a physician and a physician's daughter. Brown at the time, he said, had 110 students and 12 faculty, but graduated as the elected class poet at Brown. Very bright, in fact, brilliant, I think, young man. He's my favorite character in the Lincoln White House, including Lincoln. You have to really, I don't have time to get into it all. As the book shows, just a really brilliant, charming young guy. Many people said that you could not speak to John Hay for more than 15 minutes without him saying something wonderful that you couldn't wait to go tell somebody else. And that Hay had this knack of somehow giving the impression that you had inspired this great thought. So that you would walk away not only impressed with John Hay, but compellingly well pleased with yourself, as one of the people who dealt with him would say. The third aide, William Stoddard, also in his 20s, was 25 years old when he started. Nicolay was 29, Hay 22, Stoddard 25. That's it. Three kids in their 20s. I say, to me, they're kids in their 20s. The complete and total sum of Lincoln's staff throughout the Civil War. Stoddard was put in charge of correspondence at the White House and later wrote about his experiences there pretty extensively. He said in connection with that correspondence job that whenever a man goes clean crazy, he sits down right away and writes a letter to the President of the United States. You got to see some of the things that came in there. They had letters about twice a month from the angel Gabriel, supposedly written in blood, which Stoddard said looked to him like an inferior brand of red ink. A committee of the Founding Fathers wrote repeatedly to Lincoln, all of them dead, with the help of a spiritualist. Stoddard said that the insane asylums on the other side must be very poorly managed. And he had a slot on his desk, a correspondence desk with big pigeonholes on it, with the names of important people that he put the big letters in, and he had another slot that was labeled crazy and poetry. This is the floor plan of the second floor of the White House in Lincoln's day, which is very different from what it is today, and I don't have time to go through it all, but I'll point out to you that the President's office was here in the southeast corner, almost in the corner. Next to it was Nicolay's office with an adjoining door. That is what is now called the Lincoln bedroom. It was never Lincoln's bedroom. It was Lincoln's office. And they've refurbished it as a bedroom, but it was not that at all. Here is the waiting room where people would come and wait to see him, and the anteroom where more important people would wait. Across from that is the bedroom of Nicolay and Hay, who shared a bedroom there, which was not an advantage. They were there 24 hours a day. Lincoln took advantage of that opportunity, would come in the middle of the night to talk with them, pull them out, get them working on whatever had to be done. And over here is the office of Hay and Stoddard that they shared. So this area right here is the working area of the White House. The rest is the President's bedroom, Mrs. Lincoln's adjoining bedroom, which was the fashion among upper-end people in those days, and the hallway. And all of that space, all of this space was pretty much semi-public. The Lincolns could walk out of their bedroom one morning and bump into anybody who might be wandering down that hall. This area here, the working area that Lincoln called the shop, was completely open to the public. Anybody who wanted to could come up those stairs and into that working area, take a seat in the waiting room or the empty room, wait to see the president, and eventually would get there. This is, again, the start of this first principle I talked about of using the White House as a public tool for people to get to see the president, communicate with the president. I'll talk a bit about a little later. This is a sketch of Lincoln's office at the time, contemporary sketch. Walls covered with maps of the theaters of war. Hayes said you could tell from whatever map was on display who was in trouble in the South at the moment where the operations were being conducted. The cabinet table here where the cabinet would meet, right in Lincoln's office. There was a gas line coming down from the chandelier to the table to that lamp, which was lit by gaslight. Lincoln's little desk over here on the end, and out the window you would see the stub of the Washington Monument and the Potomac. This is a photograph of a gut renovation that was done to the White House in 1949, 1950, under the Truman administration, which most people don't know about, but I'll talk to you briefly about that at the end. But this photograph was taken from Lincoln's office, where Lincoln's office would have been. Over here at this far end, you see Nicolay and Hayes, Stoddard and Hayes' office, Nicolay and Hayes' bedroom, Lincoln's office, and that waiting area. And these beams here show you the cutoff point from the shop and the rest of the house, all of which this area was up higher than the rest of the floor because the East Room is directly beneath it. And the East Room has a very big, high ceiling. So again, I show you this because if you see this guy standing here, it gives you some sense of scale. That area is the entire presidential administrative offices of the United States of America in the middle of the Civil War. Again, strange compared to what we have today. You can't begin to think of how they even could begin to do it. I show you this cartoon from 1860, just before Lincoln was elected president, while he was running, where he's kind of duking it out here with Stephen Douglas, to show you that the White House was an icon even then. No television, no movies, no high school field trips to the White House, so people had no direct contact with it, but they knew what it was, and anybody looking at that cartoon would have known what it was. This is a shot of Lincoln's White House from the north front, Pennsylvania Avenue, taken while he was president. And I show it to you for two reasons. Again, one is the cobblestone street here with the trolley tracks running through it. It was the only paved street in the city of Washington, with the exception of about a block of a highly commercial district a few blocks away. All the other streets were dirt roads. And when it rained, as it often does in large quantity in Washington in the summer, big thunderstorm, the mud would flow in to Pennsylvania Avenue from these dirt cross streets, and the water would flow in. One British journalist said it would make a respectable trout stream down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue. One of the newspapers said the mud was neither thick enough to walk on nor thin enough to swim in. So you get some sense of what it would be like to actually go to the White House in those days. Any one of these people out in front here could have walked through the gates if they chose to do so, walk up into the portico there, into the White House, hang around on the main floor, sit down in the Blue Room, write a letter, wander upstairs, see if you could see any celebrities. Lincoln's office was open to the public if you were willing to wait long enough to get in there to see him. Nathaniel Hawthorne, from at the time the Massachusetts, went down to visit with a team of whip makers, a delegation of whip makers from Massachusetts, went in to see the president, and writes in the Atlantic magazine about that experience and how this small group of 4 or 5 people walked into the White House, and somebody recognized Hawthorne, who was a big celebrity at the time, and kind of glommed onto the group They started to go upstairs, another group glommed onto them, and by the time they walked into the president's office, there were about 25 people, none of whom had been invited, just all came in as a group. And as Hawthorne says, all of us unknown to each other, but every man and woman of us entitled to look our chief executive in the face. This cartoon, contemporary cartoon of Lincoln, the substance of it is not important here. It's actually an anti-war cartoon. But it shows you Lincoln in the posture that he actually would have displayed had that group or any one of us walked in there to see him. Everybody talks about how he would sit on one chair with his legs up on another, or have his legs draped over a table. He would get up and pace around and then lay down on the floor, or just drop down wherever he felt like it. So whoever drew that sketch must have actually been there to see that. The wastebasket with junk falling out of it, the table full of papers and stuff. This is what you had, not a ceremonial sort of place like the Oval Office is today, but an actual working office full of cigar smoke, not well decorated, just a kind of casual sort of insurance agent's office, as one visitor called it. In addition to that, in the winter between January 1 and Lent, you would have weekly levees, as they were called, basically a public reception, where anybody who wanted to could get in the reception line and eventually get through that line and shake hands with the president. So apart from being able to go in and wait in the office, if you had some business to do, you could just get in line and say hello and shake his hand. He would move you along, with very limited time. John Hayes said a lot of people tried to give him a speech, and Lincoln would just kind of press it out of him, is the way he put it, with his left hand on his back. Yes, thank you, moving him along until the next person came along. This is a cartoon at the time, subheaded Gulliver Abe in the White House, attacked by the Lilliputian office seekers. In addition to the general public coming in, Lincoln was continually besieged by people looking for federal jobs, particularly in the first few weeks or months when the administration was starting up. There were about 1,500 federal jobs to give out, just as there are today. And instead of applying through the mail or friends or contacts, people would just come into the White House and just take it over. And he would actually interview people one by one for the most menial jobs you can imagine. This is a photograph of Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, very big journalist at the time, who said, who went down there and saw this and said the thieves hunt in packs, each one trying to help the other, as they went down there to besiege Lincoln for jobs. And Greeley should know, because that's him right there in this cartoon, besieging Lincoln for his own favors and his own people to get them placed. This is the waiting room that we pointed out. That's Nicolay's office there in the corner, and Lincoln's office right there. He would sit down and talk to these people for big chunks of his day, including a doorman, a guy who wanted to be a doorman, I should say. This very simple man came to Lincoln and asked for a job as a doorman. And Lincoln had this knack of getting people to understand or say no, in a way that wouldn't be offensive to them. They're voters. He wants them to feel good about it. So the story goes from someone who was there that this man comes in and says he wants to be a doorman in the White House. And Lincoln says, well, my good man, have you got any experience as a doorman? And he says, well, no actual experience, Mr. President. Well, Lincoln says, how about theoretical experience? Do you have any theoretical experience as a doorman? Well, no, I don't. Well, have you read any books on the principles of doorkeeping? No, I can't say I have, Mr. President. Well, have you attended lectures on ethical principles of doorkeeping? Well, no, I haven't done that here. Well, can't you see, my good man, that you're just not qualified for this important position? And the guy got up and said, yeah, I absolutely can. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and walked out almost happy, with having had this chance to talk to the president. So it's funny, and it's an incredible use of the president's time, particularly in the middle of a civil war, but it had this effect of making people feel like they were in touch with the president. They could go in and see him, touch him, shake his hand, talk to him. Of course, it would be ridiculously impossible now, but in those days before air travel, when rail travel was limited, people didn't have money to travel, couldn't, conceive of leaving their own county most of the time. It was doable, although a great burden. One of those job seekers is Herman Melville, who had written a book about a whale that had failed and was looking for a job as well as consul to Florence in Italy. And refreshingly enough, an actual diplomat got that job instead of Herman Melville, who went back to the Berkshires and understood why he hadn't gotten it, and talks about shaking Lincoln's hand in the reception line and being amazed that he had shaken 1,000 hands in about 2 hours. Mrs. Lincoln, I don't have time to begin to do justice to. The only word I can come up with in these presentations is complicated. And if you read the book, you'll see why. But essentially, a very good wife and mother, did a terrific job refurbishing the White House with all this mess that I told you about. But unfortunately, did it ridiculously overreaching the budget. There was a $20,000 budget under congressional rule for the entire 4 years of the White House for furnishings, furniture, and all that. Mrs. Lincoln spent $28,000 in the first month and didn't stop, and wound up having to cover that up with the help of a bunch of unsavory people, which was quite the scandal. And again, I don't have time to get into it, but it's a story in and of itself. And to her credit, this is an engraving of Lincoln's office before she got her hands on it. One congressman said it reminded him of the breaking up of a hard winter. Another said that the furniture was ancient, went back to John Adams, but was too rickety to venerate. And you can imagine the kind of cigar smoke, worn carpet, sort of tawdry place that it was. And this is how it looked after Mrs. Lincoln had finished with it. She did this sort of thing throughout the house, did a terrific job with it, which in itself is a model for the use of the White House as a public relations tool. People coming there and seeing that, and seeing the refurbishment that was done, came away with the thought, well, I guess we're doing okay. Despite this horrible Civil War and the threat to our very existence, they're spending all this money on this, and here's this beautiful house, and I guess things are going to be all right. This is a tableau at the Lincoln Library in Springfield of Lincoln's office with the cabinet sitting around the cabinet table that I pointed out to you earlier. This is another view of that same scene. I think that the cabinet member in the lower left is looking at the bill for these refurbishments, but whatever it was, he doesn't look happy. That fireplace is still there, by the way, in what's now called Lincoln's bedroom. A few quick takes on the two most famous and important members of the cabinet. William Seward, Secretary of State, a great statesman, very charming, intelligent guy, upstate aristocrat type from New York, probably Lincoln's best friend in the White House. Their backgrounds could not have been more different, but they were very close, and Seward was a brilliant, very entertaining fellow, despite the look on his face tells you he didn't like having his picture taken, but he would have charmed you if you met him. The other is Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, who was a hard-edged guy, to say the very least. I describe him in the book as a witch trial judge, which is pretty much the demeanor that Edwin Stanton put forth. John Hay, the young John Hay, the aide, was asked by Nicolay at one point to go in and wrangle a favor from Stanton for a friend, and Hay told Nicolay that he would rather make the tour of a smallpox hospital. I show you this arrival of diplomats at the White House, which happened every January 1. There was a big diplomatic reception followed by a public reception. People would line up along Pennsylvania Avenue and down the driveway to see these diplomats come with their exotic uniforms, and the Turk here, and the Frenchman and the Italian and all their sort of fancy garb. And then they would come in themselves, line up, go through the White House for probably 4 or 5 hours, and roughly anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people would shake the hand of the president in that reception line. Can you imagine shaking 3,000 hands, in 4 hours? Roughly averaged out to about 10 seconds per hand, constantly, for 4 hours. Some of them gripping you with that, that quote, manly handshake. Lincoln learned eventually to grab them by the fingertips so they couldn't crush his hand, and then he would pass them along. And sometimes, hold one hand with his right hand, another with his left, and just keep moving people through. This shot was taken in the conservatory of a group of Plains Indians chiefs who came to a diplomatic event with the other diplomats who are standing off to the left. The diplomats' wives are next to them. There's one of their little girls in the middle. John Nicolay here in the center, and Mrs. Lincoln off to the right. There's a kind of a heartbreaking story about those very Indians. I don't have time to tell tonight, but I have to move on. Coming briefly then to the war, the issue of using the White House as a tool of the war. When the war broke out and Fort Sumter was fired on, there were large numbers of armed militia in Virginia, right across the river. How many of you have been to Washington at one time or another? Almost everybody. You'll know that the Potomac River is there, and then Virginia's right there on the other side. You could look out Lincoln's window and see Virginia. You could see Confederate flags flying, from Lincoln's window. Confederate cannon lined up on Arlington Heights, ready to shell the city. Probably about 5,000 armed men there. And in the city of Washington, there were exactly 64 American soldiers at that time. Almost all the others were off in the west, in Indian country, hundreds of miles from a railroad. So for a good 10 or 12 days until Lincoln got northern militia regiments to come down and help, the White House was defended by these 64 troops and a kind of an odd, ramshackle militia of pot-bellied congressmen and nearsighted journalists and people who had never held a gun before, who camped out literally in the White House here in the East Room and kind of bluffed their way through this until these first northern regiments arrived. This is the 7th New York. It was known as the Silk Stocking Regiment. It was primarily rich folks from Manhattan, dressed, ironically enough, in gray uniforms, which was the color of their militia uniform. And you see the procession here past the White House of the 7th New York and 22 other New York regiments that arrived soon thereafter. So once these troops arrived, the city was pretty well secure from a sneak attack or a quick attack. Here's Lincoln over in the tent there on the side, if I can find my button. In the tent there, observing them go by, passing in review. And he would then use the White House regularly, like once or twice a week, as regiments came through on their way south to fight. They would assemble on the lawn, he would come out and address them, buck them up, give them some encouragement, and also when they were coming back and going home. In those days, regiments signed up generally for a year, sometimes for 2 years, and then they went home. And so as they went home, he would address them here on the White House, thank them for their service, tell them why it was important. And then they'd go home to tell their neighbors and their families about how they had seen the president and he was confident and all of that. So he's using this setting here of the White House as a tool to promote the war. This is a photograph of what was called a zouave at the time, which were troops in regiments that liked these French Foreign Legion outfits here, rather than the sort of standard blue uniforms. That went out of fashion very quickly after the first months of the war because these made very easy targets and it was not a good thing to be walking around with people shooting at you. You can see him with his foot on the Confederate flag there. That actual flag was one that had flown from a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, that Lincoln could see from his office. And there's a story behind that as well, but I need to move on. Once those troops arrived and the war was underway, then guards were posted outside the White House. You can see these 2 sentries pacing here. And there were also cavalrymen posted at the gates, a pair of cavalrymen at each of the 2 gates. But they too would not stop you if you came in through that gate and up that walk and into the portico. Anybody who wanted to, throughout the Civil War, continued to do that. One of these guard officers said that they were more decorative than useful because they really never stopped anybody and really just kind of made a show of some sort of military ceremony. This is a painting of the regiment of troops that camped on the south grounds that made up that guard, who sort of adopted Tad Lincoln, who was 10 years old at the time, as their mascot, if you will. Tad would go out and hang out at their campfires and come home covered in soot, much to his mother's dismay. But they really took a shine to Tad. They gave him a uniform. They had a little uniform made, and they made him their colonel, as they called it. And Tad had himself photographed in his colonel's uniform, and actually it looks like General Meade there, about 10 years old. And from that point on, actually signed his letters, Colonel Tad Lincoln. I show you Hannibal Hamlin, the vice president of the United States at the time, because Lincoln refused any guard of any kind, any protection of any kind until the last few weeks of the war. And he would tell people that his best protection was the fact that his vice president was Hannibal Hamlin, that nobody would want to see Hannibal as president of the United States. He said that's an insurance policy worth all the prairie land in Illinois, and that's all the protection he needed. When Lee surrendered, the White House, a fireworks display was held at the White House in April of 1865, again as a morale-boosting device, which was done after all the big Union victories. And a man would stand at every window of the White House when it went dark, and when a band struck up, they would light a match in each of those windows. So suddenly all the windows would be illuminated, and they would have these great celebrations, again making the White House a kind of centerpiece and a morale-boosting device for the support of the war. Last big subject, this race relations issue. This is Frederick Douglass, who probably all of you have heard about. Frederick Douglass came to visit Lincoln in the White House 3 or 4 times. He conferred with Lincoln about issues facing black troops in the Union Army. Lincoln invited him to the inaugural ball. None of this had been heard of before this, before the 1860s. Black people never went near the White House. Not only did they come when Lincoln was president, but he invited them into the office, would confer with them, talk to them about policy issues. The local bishop of one of the black Episcopal churches in town came to confer with Lincoln several times. And Sojourner Truth, who many of you will have heard of, who was a great abolitionist, an escaped slave herself, came to visit Lincoln twice as well, and remarked about how the black people in his reception room were treated the same as everybody else. And again, you can't put yourself 150 years back without realizing that this was important. This was really groundbreaking stuff that had just never been done before. And Lincoln used the White House as a device for that, which is neglected in history today. Lincoln's butler was an African American as well, and he would read to him, his name was William, and he would read to him his speeches when he was getting them ready, and he read him the Emancipation Proclamation, these other things. William was totally uneducated, and Lincoln thought that if he could give a speech that Lincoln understood, or that rather William understood, and followed and felt comfortable with, then everybody else in the country would feel comfortable and understand it as well. This is a painting of a grand reception in the White House that took place regularly as well, but was very badly received by the press because of this thought of feasting and dancing while there's a coffin in the house, as one of the newspapers said, referring to the carnage that was taking place and the hardships that the troops had to endure. And I'll say just in passing, we really don't have a conception of the suffering in this war. In my day, we lost about 50,000 dead in Vietnam over the course of about 12 years. In the Civil War, there were 750,000 dead in the course of 4 years, with a population about 10% of the size of ours. So you just can't imagine the scale of this catastrophe and what Lincoln had to deal with in trying to get the country through it. These are samples of some of the dresses that the women wore at these receptions, which often had as many as 25 yards of silk, held up by cages basically made out of steel or whalebone. One general said that if anybody ever attacked Mrs. Lincoln, the ladies could just form up around her and form a fort that no assassin would ever be able to get through. This is a contemporary engraving of a dinner in the congressional dining room, as it was called at the time. And then I'll just kind of close here with some brief pass-throughs of some of the celebrities that came through as they do today. Ralph Waldo Emerson here was a visitor to Lincoln's office. Willie and Ted kind of conned him out of a quarter before he passed on to see the president. Julia Ward Howe, the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was the great song of the time, inspirational song about the war. She came and read essays in the Red Room for the Lincolns and their guests. Walt Whitman, the great Civil War poet, came frequently, didn't ever shake hands with Lincoln because he didn't want to bother him, as he said, but got quite friendly with John Hay, who was a fellow poet, and spent a lot of time at the White House. P.T. Barnum and his big star at the time, General Tom Thumb, as he was called, entertained at the White House. As did a magician called Herman the Prestidigitator, who was the great magician of his time. And McClellan, General McClellan, writes about going to a White House evening in the Red Room where Herman performed. And Herman came up to Lincoln in the middle of his act and needed a handkerchief for his trick. And he said, "So, Mr. President, may I have your handkerchief?" And Lincoln said, "Well, you got me now. I ain't got one." Which McClellan thought, being no friend of Lincoln's, was not the right thing for a president of the United States to have said. We come now to the end. This is the White House draped in crepe, black crepe, at the time of Lincoln's death, which shattered the country in a way that few of us can appreciate, except those of us, and there are a few in this room who are old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination, which was what a blow that was. And you can imagine, on top of that, that it's literally days after Robert E. Lee surrenders, and now the president is shot and killed. People were totally stunned. It happened on a Good Friday, very religious country, and of course the natural analogy was the Savior here has died on Good Friday. It was an incredibly tumultuous, traumatic event for the country. The funeral was held in the East Room, and actually under exactly the same ceremony as Mrs. Kennedy used for Kennedy's funeral, dug up from the National Archives and replicated that funeral. Here then, nearly in closing, is a wide shot of that gut renovation that Harry Truman did in 1950. This is the White House from the inside out. Nothing left but the outside walls and steel girders holding it up. And it was just falling apart so badly that there was nothing else really to do except to abandon it. And it was rebuilt with the old plans, photographs, carefully measured, moldings and all that recreated. But the White House we see today when we go in there is basically a Walt Disney version of the actual old White House. In closing then, this is John Hay at the age of 25 at the time of Lincoln's death. And this is John Hay just before his own death in 1905 when he was Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt. Had a terrific career. Not many people can say that they were working at the right hand of two people on Mount Rushmore, but John Hay could say that. I use John Hay's diary a lot in the book that he kept during the Civil War, and I'll close with the last passage from the first book, actually. A diarist to the end, Hay made an entry in 1905, less than 3 weeks before he died of a long and slow disease. I dreamt last night that I was in Washington and that I went to the White House to report to the president, who turned out to be Mr. Lincoln. He was very kind and considerate and sympathetic about my illness. He said there was little work of importance on hand, and he gave me 2 unimportant letters to answer. I was pleased by that this slight order was within my power to obey. I was not in the least surprised by Lincoln's presence in the White House, but the whole impression of the dream was one of overpowering melancholy. And with that sad note, that's my story. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that anybody may have. Yes, sir.
In Doris Kearns' book, Team of Rivals, it mentions Lincoln bringing all of his rivals in the White House. How did that really play out?
Yeah, generally pretty well. There was, one of those rivals, Simon Cameron, was made Secretary of War at the beginning of the war and turned out to be corrupt, taking bribes basically from military contractors. So that was the end of him, and he was replaced by Edwin Stanton. And Lincoln had a running battle with the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, who wanted nothing more than to be president himself and was constantly trying to undermine Lincoln. Chase had a beautiful young daughter who was about 20 years old. It was kind of the belle of Washington. Kate Chase was famous in her day, kind of like the Kardashians today, at least on the Washington stage. John Hay was smitten with her, among many others, and said that Kate Chase was only a little more beautiful than any other woman, which is kind of typical of Hay. But beyond that, it worked out really well. Lincoln, tapped the intelligence and the experience of all the great men who had run against him for president and made that work really well. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. Why do you think Lincoln was so transformative at making the White House what he made it? And why, after his death, did it decline so vastly, aside from security matters today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, he had come from the people and often said that and was always very much aware of that and wanted to eliminate any semblance of aristocracy or distance of any kind. And secondly, he thought that his major job, believe it or not, even in the middle of a civil war, was to be in touch with the people, physically in touch with the people. There was no polling in those days, if you keep that in mind. And so he would learn from what they said, what they were thinking. He would often ask what people were thinking, what they were saying. So he would draw information from that. He would interview junior officers, who came to the White House and met with him. He knew what the generals were telling him, but he wanted to know what was really happening, at the ground level. And he would interview these young officers and also enlisted men, who would come in and talk with him. So you really get a better sense of all of that. And he felt that, every hand he shook, which there were thousands and thousands of, and every person he saw was going to go home and tell everybody in their village or their neighborhood, I just met the President of the United States, and he greeted me warmly, and he listened to me, and I told him this, and I told him that, and it really worked beautifully well. Obviously, you can't do anything like that now, and no other president before or since did anything on that scale.
I found it shocking when you talked about how little security there was back then. There was virtually none, because it's hard to believe with all the security today. But my question is, after Lincoln's assassination, even though it didn't occur anywhere near the White House, do you think that was the security heightened after that happened? Were the people scared?
Well, there's 2 answers to that, really. One is, I should say too, that as I mentioned briefly, in the last month or two, this was the last 2 months of Lincoln's time, they did bring on 4 DC policemen who did 8-hour shifts. But these DC policemen were drunks and ne'er-do-wells, and all of them had been punished and sanctioned and, beat people up. I mean, they were just the dregs, and that's what the Washington police force consisted of, because policemen were paid less than a lamplighter, and they had very dangerous, tough jobs, so who wanted it? And you would only get the kind of dregs of society taking these jobs. And one of them was assigned to go with Lincoln on the night he went to the theater, and did, and went next door and had a drink, you know, in a tavern, instead of being there when Booth came in. Now, to answer your question more directly, right after Lincoln was killed, it was actually less security than there had been, because President Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, let Mrs. Lincoln stay in the White House for a month, you know, until she was ready to leave, and didn't work there and didn't live there. So there being no president in residence, the 4 policemen were withdrawn, okay? And the staff were demoralized and upset, and people just poured through the White House, cutting off curtains and sofas, and, you know, for souvenirs, they took figurines. They actually carried furniture out of the White House, you know, as souvenirs. There was nobody minding the shop at all for that month. After Johnson came in, they did have some more security than they had, but it wasn't until many years later that anything like the security we have today was put in.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about where you got your sources and how you used your sources for the book? I mean, obviously you did a lot of research.
Yeah, well, I work in Boston, and there's a terrific library called the Boston Athenaeum, right across the street from where I work. And it's a gorgeous building, number one, built in the 1840s, totally renovated a few years ago, but it's got terrific resources, particularly in the Civil War period, because, you know, again, it was built in the 1840s, and Union officers coming back from the war brought back with them a lot of material, a lot of books, diaries, newspapers, you know, propaganda, and the rest. So they have a great collection. Plus, they have memoirs, you know, collected letters, and the rest. And what they don't have, they can order from other libraries. And most of this stuff is online. You know, if you know where to look for it, most of these diaries and letters and memoirs are online. Anything earlier than 1924 is pretty much Googled now, you know, scanned on. So it's really not hard to, well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's not mechanically difficult to dig this stuff out. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, I have a question.
One more.
Isn't there speculation that Hay wrote the Gettysburg Address, or another big address that Lincoln takes the credit for?
Yeah.
And do you think after, Hay is a pretty fascinating guy, particularly since, I don't think he wasn't a resident of New Hampshire, but he had the house in New Hampshire. But I'm just curious as to when I get the feel for that, doing the research, that definitely this man is the one that wrote that.
Well, not the Gettysburg Address, but there is a famous, Hay wrote a lot of stuff for Lincoln, okay? And he's a great writer. And Lincoln is a great writer too, but not an elegant writer. Lincoln was like, you know, he'd get to the point, simple, straightforward writing, but Hay was just a really elegant, natural writer. And, you know, he wrote a lot of letters for Lincoln. And one time, in fact, a prominent editor wrote to Lincoln, very irate, that he had heard that John Hay was writing letters, you know, and signing Lincoln's name to them, and that this was really outrageous. And also, he had heard that the staff, these 3 young guys in their 20s, were filtering the mail and not getting it to Lincoln. And, you know, what did he have to say for himself about this? So a letter goes back to the editor saying, I can assure you that every important letter that comes to me comes to my direct attention. Didn't define the word important. And, you know, I'm right on top of everything, and you don't have to worry about any of that. Signed Abraham Lincoln, and written by John Hay. I think the one you're thinking about is, if you remember the movie Saving Private Ryan, most of you probably saw that. There's a scene in the beginning of that movie where General Marshall is telling these colonels that we're going to go get this kid that's behind the lines in Normandy, and he reads a letter, actually starts reading it, and then he recites it from memory, that Lincoln wrote to a Massachusetts woman who had lost 5 sons, you know, in the war, and about this great sacrifice that she had made. And Hay wrote that. That's the, I think that's the famous thing that you're talking about. Hay was quite the guy. Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, very nice, thank you.